Guys, it's Ruben here from the future, and I've just finished making the wall slash safe zone videos, these two parts that you're going to be watching. And we also implement the water so that when you go under the water, it changes the water and the player can actually drown in the water now. But I just want to warn you, these videos are very complicated. They are long, they're tedious, and there's a lot of complexity in them. Please don't be intimidated if you don't understand everything in this video, and hang in there because I promise you it is worth it. It's just two more videos and then we have the wall and we have the water, and that brings us so much closer to finishing this game. So hang in there and good luck with these next two videos. Welcome back. In this video we're going to be making the safe zone or the storm. Now what I've done is I've just clicked on all the walls in my map and I just went ahead and deleted them. You can see here they are here. We're just going to delete these and we're going to delete the floor as well. Like so. And I'm going to take my starter island, so click on the starter island. You can hold shift to select the text on the island as well and just move it over. We want a lot of space here. And what we're going to do is go to landscape and we're going to create a new landscape. So to make the landscape, just click on create. And this will make a new landscape. The landscape will allow us to make stuff like hills and that sort of thing. So if I come down here, you can see the landscape is just a little bit too low. We need to move it up. So click on the landscape and then go to the Z location and then set that to be, I don't know, 150. It looks like maybe 175 is the right number. So if we use 175, that looks to be correct. So now we have all of the objects sitting in the world, and you'll notice the world's a lot bigger now. And I didn't really move these enough. So let's go ahead and click on these here, and we'll just move these out. So this is still our starter island. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to sort of mold my landscape. Now, this isn't a level design video or anything like that. I'm teaching you guys strictly how to code. But what we're going to do to make our landscape is click on the landscape tab, and we'll just do some really basic landscaping. So if you go to the sculpt option here, we're going to set the brush size to be, I don't know, 8,000. And if you hold shift, you can actually indent the world. And what we're trying to make here is just like a basic island. So let's just go ahead and do that. Just make sure that it's lowered on all of the corners, and then we're going to add some water in to kind of give it that feel that it's an island. So cool. And we'll go into the water plane and we're going to click on lake, blueprint, and you can see there's this blueprint called lake water. Just drag it into the level and then set the scale X to be maybe 20,000 and set the scale Y to be 20,000 as well. And now you're going to have massive water in your level. And just move this as you see fit to create sort of an island. You can get rid of these squares, by the way, by just building the lighting, which you can do by going to build and then click on build lighting only. But that looks good to me. And if I search my world outliner for player start, I'm just going to delete the network player start in the level. And I'm going to come over to my starter island here. And I'm going to drag in some player starts. So if you go to the place, drag some player starts onto the starter island. And now if I hit play, all of my players are going to start on the starter island, and then basically once the plane flies us in, you'll be able to land on the actual main island. So that just kind of sets us up for where we're going next. So now we can actually get into making we'll call it the play area. I know people call it stuff like the storm or whatever, but I'm going to go with play area. Okay, so inside of our blueprints folder, I'm going to right click and I'm going to make a new blueprint, and we'll actually call it the safe zone. So we're going to make an actor and call this BP underscore safe zone. And we'll double click on the safe zone to open it up. And we need to start modifying a couple of these defaults on the side here. By default, we want to hide the safe zone because we're going to show it later on in the game. And we're going to make sure that the wall's always relevant, because no matter how far you are from the storm or the play area, whatever you want to call it, we always want to be able to see updates from it and see what it's doing. We're going to replicate the movement so that the server is in control of where the safe zone moves to. And we're also going to check the replicates box. So that's kind of all of the initial setup. And it only needs one component. It needs a static mesh component. And if I drag and drop that on, that's the only thing we need. And I'm going to call it wall mesh. Okay, so that's our wall mesh. And under the static mesh section here, we're going to type play area. Oh, what did I call it? SM underscore safe zone wall. There we go. So you'll notice it's just a tiny little wall. We're going to make a custom shader for this as well. So if we go to the, we'll just make it in here. Why not? Let's make a new material. I'm going to call this M underscore safe zone. So this is the material that will be applied to the safe zone. And it's really not going to be too complicated. If we open this up, I'll just make it really quickly. You know, these videos aren't really about making shaders and things like that, but we'll very, very briefly make a little shader here. So we're going to go to blend mode, translucent, because we want the wall to be a little bit see-through. And we're going to make it two-sided as well. And under the base color, I'm going to make a 3 vector. So type in 3 vector, and we're going to select constant 3 vector, which is basically just a color, if that makes sense. It's 3 values, which will make a color for us. And for my numbers here, I'm going to do 0.1, 0, and 0.1. And you can see that's kind of like a nice little purple color. And we'll plug that into the base color. And now we need to do the opacity. We're going to do some fairly special stuff for the opacity, but nothing too crazy. We're going to use something called a depth fade. A depth fade will fade the wall out when it collides with the ground. It just makes it look a lot nicer. So where the wall connects with the ground, it'll look a little bit different instead of just like kind of harshly connecting. And we're going to use a lerp here. I am sort of rushing over this, I'm sorry. This really isn't meant to be explaining shaders, so I just want to kind of get this done. The fade distance on the wall, we're going to make 1,000. And we're going to make a couple of parameters here. We'll type scalar parameter. A scalar parameter is just a number, basically. And I'll call that one opacity. And I'm going to set the value for it to 0.6. And we'll plug that into B. And then for A, we're just going to have this set to 1. And then from there, we can plug that into the opacity. So if you hit apply, we've just made a really basic, there you go. It's very, very simple. It's just kind of a see-through purpley material. And if we go back into the safe zone and select it, so if we type in safe zone, you can see our wall is now see-through. It's really small right now though, so we're going to fix that in a second. So let's go ahead and make it a lot bigger because we want the wall to be massive. The special thing about this wall right now is that it's only 1 unit wide, and that makes it really nice for working with it later. It makes our life a lot easier. So let's go to the construction script, and I'm going to set the world scale 3D of the wall mesh. And we're going to set the scale to make vector. And we're going to make something called the height of the wall. So drag out, promote to variable, and I'm going to call this height. This represents the height of the wall. I'm going to do the same thing, except this one is going to be called radius, and it's going to be replicated because all the players in the game need to know what this value is. So we'll go ahead and connect that up like that. And now we can sort of set some defaults. I'm going to say that by default, I want the wall's height to be 15,000 units high. So it's going to be very high. And we're going to set the radius of the wall to be 30,000 units wide. So we'll type in 30,000. And then we're going to compile, we're going to save. And let's go ahead and actually drag the wall in. And there you go. So you can see the wall roughly wraps around the whole map. Now, we want this to be changeable as well. So we'll open up the safe zone, and where it says radius, click on instance editable. And now what that'll do is if we select the wall and the level, we can actually change this straight away. So I could change this to 40,000, for example. And you can see that it updates in real time. So when we're inside of the map, basically what we're going to do is we're just going to shrink this down. And as it shrinks, it will engulf the players and force them into the center or into a certain point within the map. Inside of the game state, I want to store a reference to the play area. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to click on the plane and I'm going to hit Control W to duplicate the plane, and then I'm going to call this safe zone. So if we go down to variable type and type in safe zone, we're going to go BP safe zone and then save that and compile. So this is now storing the safe zone inside of it. And what we're going to do is back in the BP safe zone, when the safe zone begins play in the game, we're going to grab the game state and then tell the game state about the safe zone. So we're only going to do this on the authority because it's a replicated variable. So check that we have authority, get the game state. We're going to cast this to the BR game state. We are going to then set the safe zone. So drag out set safe zone and then plug that in. And we're setting the safe zone to this, or self. So we're telling the game state about the safe zone. We're telling it that it exists. Okay. Now we want to do something where we figure out where the wall's going to go next. So the wall's going to be shrinking in stages. And the first thing we need to work out is how much smaller is the wall going to get. So we're going to make a variable called next radius. I'm going to click on radius and I'm just going to hit Control W and I'm going to call this one next radius. So basically, what is the next radius of the wall going to be? And I'm going to hold Alt and drag that in to set the next radius. So now we need to figure out what are we setting the next radius to. And I'm going to set the next radius equal to the radius multiplied by some value that I want it to shrink by. So we're going to select float by float and right click and promote this to a variable called shrink multiplier. So this is the amount that we're shrinking by each time we shrink the wall, basically. So it'll shrink faster and faster. And I think a good value for this is 0.8. And that's basically just saying that every time the wall shrinks, make it go to 0.8 of its original value. The next thing we need to work out is how fast should the wall shrink at. And we're going to call this shrink speed. So what we'll do is I'll select the shrink multiplier and hit Control W. And I'll call this shrink speed. And now we're going to hold Alt, drag shrink speed in to set it. And now I need to figure out what am I setting the shrink speed to. So what we're going to do is we're going to take the radius. We're going to subtract the next radius to find the difference between this radius and what the next radius is going to be. And then if we divide that by something that we'll call the shrink time, then that will work. So let's make shrink time as well. We're going to click on shrink speed, hit Control W, and I'll call this shrink time. And we're going to say that by default, it takes the wall 40 seconds to shrink. So hold Control, drag shrink time in and connect that up like so. And then plug that into the shrink speed. So we're taking the difference and then dividing that by the amount of time it should take for us to shrink. And that is how we come to the speed. So that's how we figure out what the speed is. I know that's maybe a little bit confusing, but hopefully that makes sense. The next thing that we need to do is we need to figure out the next location that the wall goes to. So yeah, the wall's going to shrink and it's going to get smaller, but the wall's also going to move. Because if we move the wall, then there's no guarantees where the wall's going to end up. If we didn't move the wall would just shrink into the center of the map every game and players would get super bored of our game. So what we're going to do is we're going to make something called next location. So add a variable called next location, and it needs to be a vector because it's storing a location. And we want to make this replicated as well. And then we're going to go ahead and hold Alt and drag next location in to set it. And there's really a lot of work to figure out where the next location is because we have to do quite a bit of stuff. And I don't want to do all the math in here. It would just get too messy. So what I'm going to do instead is I'm going to make a function that will get the next location for us. So go ahead and click on add function and call this get next location. And we'll also mark it as pure so that we get rid of that white connection wire thing. Okay. So, there is a lot going on here, and I'll kind of breeze through this because just in the interest of time, I really don't want these lessons to be too long. What we'll do is we'll take the radius and we'll subtract that from the next radius. So we're getting the difference between where the wall's at now and where it's going to be in the next shrink. And we're going to multiply that by 0.5. So we only want half of that value. Okay. And we are going to do a random float. So what we're doing is we're kind of doing similar to what we did with the plane. We're going to get a random direction. So do random float in range. And for your min value, you're going to want -180 and +180. And we're going to hit Control C and Control V to copy and paste that. And so this top one's going to be cosine degrees. And this one is going to be sine degrees. So sine's telling you how far on the y-axis, and cosine's telling you how far it should go on the x-axis, or direction. And if this is a little bit confusing, I'm sorry. For me to really in-depth explain this would just take too long. And, you know, I'm just showing you guys how to get a Battle Royale game as fast as possible. And if I went too much in depth, it would just take up too much time. So we're going to take that -0.5 value and multiply that by -1, because this is going to be in the other direction as this. Because remember, if we multiply something by -1, we get the opposite direction. So we're going to start off by multiplying our cosine value like that, and we're going to multiply our sine value as well. And this will all come together in a sec. There's quite a lot of math that goes into this. We're going to get a random float in range of the negative value, and then the normal value is the max. And we're going to copy and paste this to do the same thing again, except this time what we want to do is we want to use this negative value as the min, and we want to use this value as the max. So we're just doing the same thing again, and we're multiplying that by these random directions that we've found. So we're basically getting a random direction, and then we're sending the random direction the required amount of units, and like we're sending it the required amount of units so that the next location that it's shrinking to isn't too far outside of the next one. That's kind of the best way I could explain it, and I'm sorry if that doesn't really do it justice, but as you get better at blueprints, you will be able to come back to stuff like this and reread it and understand it later on. But yeah, I hope that makes sense anyway. What we're going to do now is we're going to take the location of the wall, or the safe zone, and we need to add our current location to this new value that we're about to come up with, and then that's the value that we are going to return. So we'll make a new vector, or a new location basically. We're going to plug this into the X, we're going to plug this into the Y, and for the Z, we're not going to change the Z value of the wall. The Z value is going to stay the exact same. So what we want to do is take the location of the actor, break that location, and then plug the Z into here, because we really want that Z value to stay the same. And then we're going to add that in there like so. And then what we'll do is we will break this vector up into its different components. And then finally, we can return a value. So we're going to click on this, add an output, and I'm going to call this next location. And I'm going to make this a vector. And then we're going to finally put this all together. So we're going to make a vector. We're going to plug the X in, we're going to plug the Y in, and then we're going to keep the Z as what it was before. So yeah, I know that was a lot. It is pretty complex. There's a lot of math going on here, but feel free to read this as many times as you need, or even just come back to it when you're more advanced at blueprints. But the general gist of what this is doing is it's finding a new location somewhere inside of this circle, basically, that we're going to move to. So anyways, go back to the event graph, drag up from here, and then just type in get next location. And now you're all set up. The next location has been generated. By default, when the game starts, we don't want the wall to be doing damage to anyone, but we're going to enable the wall so that it starts doing damage once the game actually starts. So by default, it's going to be dormant, and then we'll activate it later. And to activate it later, we'll make an event to do that. So right click and add a custom event, and we're going to call this enable safe zone. And we're going to check that you are the server, because the server is going to be in control of all of this stuff. And what we're going to do is we're going to make a new variable called enabled. And this is going to be a Boolean variable, meaning it can be true or false. And we're going to make it replicated. And by default, it's going to be false. The wall is not enabled. However, I'm going to hold Alt, drag this in, and enable the wall essentially. And now what we need to do is once the wall's enabled, we are going to set a timer to start shrinking the wall. So basically we're counting down until the wall can start shrinking. So I'm going to make another event, and I'm going to call it begin shrinking. So when we call this event, the wall is going to start shrinking down. And we want to set a timer by event. And the event here is going to be the begin shrinking event. And we're not going to make it loop, but we need to think about how long we want to wait before the wall should start shrinking. And I'm actually going to make this a variable. So if we right click, promote this to a variable, we can call that the hold time, aka how long should the wall hold for before it starts shrinking. So if I click on hold time, I'm going to type in 120, meaning 120 seconds or 2 minutes until the wall starts shrinking. Okay, let's continue on here. So begin shrinking. This needs to be done on the authority. Now, here's the thing. We only set the timer to begin shrinking if we're on the server, so technically we'll still be on the server anyway. But I'm just going to switch has authority anyway, just to be safe. And yeah, okay, so let's see. We've begun shrinking. So one thing I want to do is I want to keep track of how many shrinks we've done. So we're going to make a variable for that. I'm going to add variable. So we'll call it num shrinks, and it will be of type integer. And then what we're going to do is we're going to drag it in, hold control, and then we're going to increment it. So that just means make it go up by 1. Okay. And now what we want to do is we're going to set something called the start shrink location. This is basically just saying where was the wall when we started shrinking, and we need this for later. So we're going to hold Control W to duplicate the next location, and I'm going to call it start shrink location. And we're going to hold Control and set that. And we want to set that value to wherever the wall is now. So to get the location of the wall, since it's an actor, we can just use the get actor location node. Okay. Now what we want to do is we want to tell the wall that we've begun shrinking. So click on enabled, hit Control W, and we're going to make a new variable called shrinking. So this is going to basically hold the value true or false. Are we shrinking or are we not shrinking? And hold Alt, connect that up, and we're going to say, yes, we are now shrinking. Okay. The next thing we're going to do is we're going to get the time that we begun shrinking as well. So we will just duplicate, click on num shrinks as well. That needs to be replicated as well. So yeah, we need another variable. So add variable, and we're going to call this one begin shrink time. So this is the time in the game when we began shrinking. So how many seconds has the game been running for at the time we started shrinking? So hold Alt, drag that in, and set that. And to get the time, you can simply just do get time seconds. I'm going to select get time seconds. And now the last thing we need is to work out the shrink speed. To work out the shrink speed, we've already done that up here. So actually we can just copy this and paste it. Because every time the wall shrinks, we're going to have to work out the new shrink speed, because the shrink speed is going to be changing all the time. because the wall is 80% of its previous value. So the speed we need to shrink is going to be different for each time that we shrink. And the last thing we need to do is, now that we've actually activated the wall, now that we've begun shrinking, we want to actually show the wall in the game, because by default we're going to hide it so that you can't really see it at the start. So we'll type set actor hidden in game, and then just leave that unchecked. So if the actor was hidden in game, now it's going to be visible in the game. So that is the begin shrinking logic. Now we need to do something inside of the tick event. And we're also going to do something to, well, we're going to do two things. We're going to shrink the wall. And if any players are outside of the wall, we're going to hurt them. We're going to deal damage to them. So let's implement tick. We're going to type tick. So just as we use tick to make the plane slowly glide over the map, we're going to use tick to make the wall slowly sort of close in, basically. So, yeah. So let's see here. Inside of tick, the first thing we want to do is we want to check if the wall is currently shrinking. So we're going to use a branch to do that. I'm going to plug that in, and if the wall is shrinking, so I'm going to make a new event, and I'm going to say update wall transform. So basically the transform is like the size, the rotation, things like that. How are we going to update that? And we're going to add an input, and that input is going to be the delta seconds. And the delta seconds is just the time that's passed since the last frame was drawn to the screen. So it's available inside of the tick event. So if the wall's currently shrinking, we're going to update the wall transform. If the wall's not shrinking, then we don't have to do any changing to how the wall looks, because it's just going to stay in the same place. And then if the wall is enabled as well, so wall is enabled, hold control and drag enabled in, and we're going to make a branch for enabled, and then we'll plug both of these in. And now what we're going to do is we're going to basically say, is anyone outside of the wall? So regardless of whether or not we're shrinking, we still need to deal damage to people that are outside of the wall. And the way that we do that is we're going to first make sure that we're on the server. So type authority, because we're dealing damage, so we want to do that on the server. And I'm going to make a event. We can actually copy and paste this one. And I'm going to hit F2 to rename it, and I'm going to call this damage players outside wall. So basically we're just checking for who's outside the wall, and then we can deal the damage to those players. Okay. So damage players outside wall. And we just connect up the delta seconds as well, because we need to know how much time's passed in the game since the last frame was drawn to the screen. Okay, so we've called all of that. Now update wall transform is the first thing that we're going to work on, because it's fairly complicated and it'd be nice to get it out of the way. So the first thing we need to do is we need to take the amount of time that's passed since the last frame was drawn on the screen, and we need to multiply the shrink speed by that. So actually hold control and drag in the shrink speed, and then multiply that value by a float, and that float is going to be delta seconds. So what we're doing here is we're coming up with the new radius, and since this is called every tick, we're just going to make the radius get slightly smaller each time that a new frame is drawn to the screen. So over time it'll slowly get smaller. I'm going to hold Alt and drag in the radius to set the radius, and we want to set the radius to the current radius size. So radius, here it is here. Minus the shrink speed. So what this is doing is it's just slowly shrinking the wall over time. Okay, so we've set the radius of the wall. So now what we can do is we can do set actor scale 3D to change the scale of the wall. And all we need to do is just make a vector like so. And we're going to get our radius and plug it into the X and Y, and we're going to get our height and plug that in to the Z. Okay, so now we are setting the scale of the wall. We also want to activate the wall. So in BR game state, I'm going to add some logic to activate the wall. So hold control and drag the safe zone in, and then we're going to do a little check to make sure that the safe zone is actually valid, and it should be valid. And if it is valid, it should be valid because we've set it. We're going to enable the safe zone if that happens. So go ahead and plug is valid into enable safe zone like that. And we're doing all of this inside of the BR game state. Also, one of the biggest things, and I totally can't believe I missed this out, is that if you click on the wall mesh, the wall should not have any collision. So go to the collision presets and select no collision. There should be absolutely no collision on the wall whatsoever. Okay, so this works so far, and if you try it in the game, you'll actually see it works, but we also want to make it move to this next location and not just shrink into the center of the map. So the way that we're going to do that is we're going to set the location of the wall, and we're going to do that using set actor location. So type in set actor location, and we need to set the location, and to do that we're going to use something called vinterp2 constant. So we use this for the plane actually as well. So just like we used the vinterp for the plane to make it glide over the map, we're going to use the vinterp for the wall to make it sort of slowly close in. So the current position of the wall is the get actor location value. So wherever the wall is right now, that's how we figure it out. And we want to move it to the next location. So hold control and connect up next location to the target. The next thing we need to know is the delta time, which we have here. I'm just going to drag down and add a reroute node so it looks a little bit cleaner, and we'll plug that in there. And the speed in which we want to interpolate at is very slightly more confusing, but not too bad. We're going to take the location that we started shrinking at, and we're going to take the location that we're moving towards, and we need to figure out how far apart these distances are. And to do that, you simply subtract these from each other, and then you can do something called vector length, which will tell you the length of a vector. So the difference between these, we're taking the length of that, and then we're dividing that by the shrink time. So go ahead and take that, and then take your shrink time, so hold control, drag the shrink time in, and that will now set the wall to slowly move in. The last part is we want to figure out if we've actually finished closing in, and once we've done that, we're going to queue up the next shrink. So shrink the wall, figure out when it's small enough, and then we're going to make the wall stay the same size for a while, and then shrink again. You get the idea. You've probably done this in a Battle Royale game before. Basically, yeah, the wall's going to shrink over time in cycles. So the way that we figure out if this cycle is finished is we're going to do a branch. What we're looking for is a true or false value. Basically, has it finished or not? Okay, so we only want to do this on the server, so has authority. And we're going to look for something else. So for an and to return true, both of these inputs need to be true. So we need to be the server, but we also need to check if the wall shrink is done. So we're going to get the time seconds. We're going to subtract that from the amount of the begin shrink time, which is here. Hold control, drag that in. And then we're going to divide that by the shrink time. Hold control, drag that in. And then we just want to check if that value is greater than or equal to 1. And if it is, then we know that we're ready to stop the shrink and queue up a new one. So to stop shrinking the wall, hold control, drag in shrinking, and then set that to false to say, hey, we're no longer shrinking anymore. But it's not enough to just do to stop shrinking. We actually need to queue up some other settings as well, like the next location, the next radius, that sort of thing. So yeah, it's a bit boring, but we have to do the stuff all over again that we did up here. Luckily, it's all pretty easy. So we're going to hold Alt. We're going to drag in the hold time. Because what we want is we want the hold time to go down as the game goes on. So go to hold time. I've got my hold time set to 10, but you'll have 120. Make sure that's set to 120. And what we're doing is basically every time the wall shrinks, we want the wall to start shrinking faster and faster. And we do that by taking the next radius and multiplying that radius Oh, sorry, the hold time. We're going to take the hold time, drag that in, and multiply it by what we'll call the time multiplier. So we're going to make the time multiplier, right click on here, promote to variable. We'll call this time multiplier. So just as we have a shrink multiplier, we're also going to have a time multiplier. And I'll just set the time multiplier equal to 0.8 as well. That 0.8 is a pretty good value. So make it shrink 80% faster than it previously did, is pretty much all we're saying. And once we've set the hold time, we need to set the next radius. And the next radius is pretty much the same as we did before. Hold Alt. We're going to set this. To find the next radius, we're going to do the same thing we did last time. We're going to take the next radius, the current next radius, and then multiply that by, let's see, float multiplied by float. We're going to multiply that value by the shrink multiplier, so 0.8. So that will make sure that the next circle is smaller than the current circle is. And the next location can be set by just doing set next location, and dragging out from next location, we're going to type get next location. So that'll set the next location of the wall. And then from there, we're going to set the shrink time. So set shrink time. And the shrink time is simply just going to be set to whatever the shrink time is currently, multiplied by our time multiplier. So plug that in there. And hold control and drag our time multiplier in. So what we're doing is we're just making the wall shrink faster and shrink smaller with each cycle. And then to actually check if we need to finish shrinking or not, because what we want to do, right, is eventually the wall is going to get so small that it might only be, say, 10 meters wide. If that's the case, then we really just want to stop shrinking the wall entirely. So I'm going to make a value here. We'll click on time multiplier and duplicate it. I'm going to call this max radius or min radius. What's the smallest the radius of the wall can be before I just don't want to shrink it any smaller, basically. So to figure this out, we're going to do the radius. And for the min radius, I'm going to use a value of 5,000. So I don't want the wall to get any smaller than 5,000. Once it gets to 5,000, we're pretty much done. So we'll take the radius, and we're going to check if the radius is still greater than the min radius. And if it's still greater than the min radius, we can go ahead and queue up another wall shrink, basically. So we're going to use our set timer by event. And we're going to drag in our hold time. So hold control and drag hold time in there. And if that doesn't happen, if we have reached the smallest radius, we're going to finish shrinking the map. So I'm going to hit shrinking, and I'm going to hit Control W to duplicate that. And I'm just going to make a variable called finished shrinking. And this will allow us to check whether the wall's actually done shrinking or not. So hold Alt, connect that up to the false pin, and then set that to true. Basically saying that now, yes, we have finished shrinking. And then the last thing I need to do is I need to connect the event up to my begin shrinking event. So we're going to come down here, and I'm just going to add some reroute nodes to do this. So we'll drag out like this, reroute, drag that down, and then plug that into there, and done. To test this out in a manner that doesn't involve us waiting ages, what we can do is we can go into the safe zone blueprint, and we can click on the shrink time, and we can just make the shrink time, 5 seconds, and that'll make it shrink really quickly. And we could also make the hold time really quick as well, so we can make it hold for only like 5 seconds and hit compile and save. Now we'll have to remember to change those back when we're done, but if I hit play, and then what I'll do is I'll eject from the game. And then I'll sort of come here over the map, and we'll sort of just take a look at the safe zone from above. And it shouldn't take long for the safe zone to pop up. So here we go. So because we have the time set really fast, it's just going to be shrinking super fast, and we can observe how it works. So we'll click on the safe zone, and you can see it's totally working. Really cool. And if I jump on the plane here, I can drop from the plane and see what this looks like as a player. When I was writing the shader as well for the the wall and I told you about that depth fade thing. Now you can see what I mean by it. See how where the wall collides with the ground, it's got a bit of a fade going on? Well, that's what we were doing there. Now, the wall's really aggressive. There's no way I could outrun this. It's just super fast because we've set the settings very quick on it. But then notice that when it gets to a certain radius, it'll stop, right? So we can set where that end point is, and this is how small the wall's going to be at the end of the game. So here you can see the wall's working, and in the next video, we're going to make the wall deal damage. So I'll see you guys there.